The challenge is that I think I'm going to try to show you that this can be done in a very interactive way, and I'm going to try to use some pedagogy here that you could use with your students if you're interested in this. And behavioral economics obviously has lots of financial implications, and we'll look at a few of those as we move through this. But trying to make the same sorts of interactive stuff work, in WebEx is a little bit hard, but I'll try to use the chat, and I'd really appreciate a little bit of feedback from you because it makes it a lot more interesting if we do it that way. So let's first think about behavioral economics and what are called cognitive biases, these things that humans seem to do that take us away from this assumption that we make in economics that humans are very rational sort of calculators of decisions. Behavioral economics kind of questions that and then says, if we know we don't always behave that way, what can we do to try to overcome some of these biases or problems? And then, as Aaron said, sometimes I call it pandemonomics, but it's basically looking at the economy and how it's been impacted by COVID. And I think I've made some interesting charts that you could certainly use, and I can share anything I have with you when we're done today that you might be able to use with your students to show them some of the interesting and quirky things that have happened because of the pandemic. So, okay, so let's start. Now, the first thing I'm going to do here is describe to you, this is a very famous activity, and if we were together, it would take some time, but we would try to do it. And you can do it in class. It's been written about in different places where you can actually, I could send you, or you could download the different things you need to give students to make this work. But now let's just do it first as a thought experiment, and then we'll use the chat in a second. So imagine an activity, and like I said, this has been done with different sorts of people, whether they be students or older folks or people employed, whatever. But the whole game is built around this idea that you've got two groups. So the first group is called a proposer. And you should imagine a room where the proposers have an actual, let's just say 1,000, I put 100, so 100 real dollars, so $100. And the proposer's job is to divide that $100 up. And they're dividing it up between themselves and then someone who's called a responder. This is anonymous. So if you do the activity in class, you've got some little documents you put numbers on, and the students write down their proposal. You then bring that to a different student who's a responder. The responder's job is to say, do I accept this allocation? So for example, if the proposer were to say, I'm going to divide this 100 up 70-30. I get 70, you get 30. Then that's anonymously brought over to a responder, and the responder can either accept or reject. If they accept it, they get their money. So in that case, the responder would get 30, proposer would get 70, we're done. If the responder rejects it, then neither of them get any money. They get zero, both of them. So that's called the ultimatum game. The ultimatum part is that if you reject, we get zero, right? It's an ultimatum. Nobody gets any money. So, but to do this, to have this work, you really need to think about this like it's real money. Like, how would you actually behave if you were doing this? Obviously, we can't be a WebEx doing it together, and we certainly can't do it with any real cash in front of us. But if we were to do it, I'm interested in how you would respond. So here's what what I'd like you to do now is imagine first you're the proposer. Let me just explain it one more time. Your job is to divide up $100 between yourself and someone you don't necessarily know them. They're the responder, and they won't ever know who you are. But you divide 100 up, however you want. The trick is that if they accept it, then you get whatever the deal was, and they get their part. If they reject it, then you both get zero. So what I'm interested in is, if you were doing this, if we were really doing this, how would you divide the money up? You could say 50-50, it could be 60-40, it could be 70-30, whatever. But I'd love to see in the chat what you might do if you were actually doing this activity. What would be your split? And put yourself first and the responder, proposer, responder. 70-30 would be 70 proposer, 30 responder. So if this makes sense, I'd love to see a few chat responses of what you do. And I'll show you in a minute what people usually do or often do. And this is the participation part. So I love some responses. Does anybody have some responses on how they would divide it up if they understood this thing?
There's a couple that are coming through to me, Scott, and so I'm seeing Hannah saying 50-50,
Yep.
Paula says 60-40, Donna
See Victor
says
60-40.
70-30, Victor 60-40.
I just saw 50-50 from Marliana. Okay, it turns out to be pretty typical. Now, that's great. That was a lot of you. So my next question is, if you were the responder, below what number would you reject the offer? Is there a number where you would say, too low, I reject? Of course, knowing that nobody gets any money then. So that's the next thing. So, Victory said 25%. So in this case, $25. Anything below that, you're going to reject it. Okay. Anybody else do the respond? I'd like some examples from the responder. I've only seen Victor's. Aaron, have you got any other ones on that one?
I've got
Hannah
10.
said 50.
Yeah, and I've got 10 from Donna, 30 from Paula.
Okay. This is pretty normal response. Now, we can't talk about this, but what normally happens, those are pretty normal responses. Of course, as you think about that, though, what people usually say is, like Hannah, you said you reject anything under 50. So you're saying that anything below 50, you're going to reject, which suggests that even if they offered you $49, $3, you're going to say, I don't want it. I won't take it. And you're going to punish yourself and you're going to punish the proposer. And when I usually ask people why they would do that, the answer usually is it's unfair. I feel like it's unfair. Of course, in an economics textbook or the way economists think about the world, that really is irrational because you're intentionally punishing yourself. Right? We normally assume sort of rationality means that you do things to benefit yourself and you would never do things intentionally to hurt yourself. If you'll reject an offer, I mean, frankly, if you ask me, I'd say I'd accept anything. $2. Two better than zero. Wasn't my money anyway. I'll take anything. But almost no one responds that way because they feel like they're being treated unfairly. But if you don't teach econ, fairness comes up very rarely in an econ book. It's not a term we use a lot, right? But it's clearly something that humans think a lot about. So the point is that an assumption of rationality, that is, that we'll always take any free money, turns out not to be true. And if it's not true, then perhaps this assumption we have about human behavior, that we're self-maximizers, that we're calculating and trying to come up with the best deal for ourselves, may not always be true, and therefore it could have implications. So turns out your responses, as I'm trying to go to the next slide, were very similar to the typical. So this has been done thousands of times. One thing I've always wondered is, what if we did it with, $1 million? Then are you really turning down 10% of that, right? That's hard to imagine. So that may be a flaw in the system, is you really turn down 10 grand or 100 grand if that's the way we're doing it, even though you're only getting 10%. I'm not going to. That's a pretty huge price to pay to punish somebody else for them being unfair, right? Not such a big deal with maybe $100. But the mean split is 60-40. I guess we call that the mode, right? The most common is 50-50, which a number of you did. And about 20% of low offers, that is anything below 50%, are rejected. So 20% of people will say, even if you want to give me a free 49, I don't want it because I want to send a message to you that you're being unfair to me. That's the way I interpret at least the results, is it just seemed unfair to you. But again, we don't usually use fairness when we think about being rational in terms of maximizing our own, whether it be incomes, profit, whatever. So it turns out, I'm going to try to play this video and I hope it works for you guys. It turns out not just humans behave that way, but monkeys will behave the same way. Let me show you this video that's kind of interesting.
So the final experiment that I want to mention to you is our fairness study. And so this became a very famous study, and there's now many more, because after we did this about 10 years ago, it became very well known. And we did that originally with capuchin monkeys, and I'm going to show you the first experiment that we did. That has now been done with dogs, birds, chimpanzees, but with Sarah Boston started out with capuchin monkeys. And what we did is we put two capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group. They know each other. We take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber. And there's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the two monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, but cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now, if you give the partner grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so if you give them grapes, it's a far better food, then you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently, we videotaped it with new monkeys who never done the task, thinking that maybe they would have a stronger reaction, and that turned out to be right. The one on the left is the monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece she eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task, and give her a piece of cucumber, and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. That's what she does. She gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. Gives a rock to us now. Gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically.
So the point is that the cucumber was fine as long as they were both getting cucumbers. But once you set up some inequity, like in the ultimatum game, if you're saying somebody gets 60, somebody gets 40, that causes problems, right? So, and again, that even to the monkey, that's irrational because the food was fine, right? And they need to eat, and nothing wrong with the cucumber. The cucumber became a problem only when they realized somebody else is getting something different. So it appears then that all these theories we have in economics at least could be questioned about perfect rationality, and we don't really assume that. But we do assume people do things generally in their own best interest, and this seems to suggest that there's some question about that. So this was made sort of well known. There's these two Israeli-born psychologists named Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky, and Kahneman's still alive. He's at Princeton and won a Nobel Prize actually in economics a number of years ago. But Michael Lewis, the famous author who wrote The Big Short and Moneyball and The Blind Side, he wrote a great book that I would encourage you to read if you're interested in this stuff about these two gentlemen. And as you know, if you've seen even the Moneyball or the Big Short movies, Lewis has an amazing way of telling stories about complicated subjects and weaving in the stories of people. And that's what he really does here, is he really talks a lot about who these gentlemen were. They were both psychologists from Israel who moved to the United States and really invented this area called behavioral economics. And these terms you may have probably heard, things like loss aversion, different biases, they really invented those through their experiments. And Lewis tracks that in his book. So behavioral economics now is a pretty well-known area. That's Richard Thaler, the picture there. He's probably the best known behavioral economist today, and I'll show you why. He did some experiments that actually got us to change our rules around how 401ks operate. That is, can we require people to, or can we opt them in essentially? But Thaler has an interesting quote there. He says, in order to do good economics, you have to keep in mind that people are human. Sometimes you feel like economics books are divorced from that concept, and they're modeling themselves around these sort of maximizers that don't actually exist in society. And then others have won Nobel Prizes in economics using behavioral economics. Oftentimes they're financial things. In fact, Robert Shiller, maybe you've heard of the Case-Shiller-Holm Index. That's what he did. But Akerlof and Fogel were also guys who did related to stock market kind of things and trading and the way psychology affects that. So it combines psychology and economics. And I think in a high school teaching setting, I think I found last week that can be very interesting because many social studies teachers teach psychology. Unlike me, they teach sociology, it's like economics, history, like lots of different social sciences. So in this case, you could probably use this in either of the two or both, and it kind of shows how the two are weaved together, which I think is interesting. It emphasizes this thing called prospect theory, as opposed to, if you teach economics, you're familiar with expected utility theory. Utility is like the satisfaction we get from things, and a normal econ book says humans want to maximize utility, make things the best for you. Prospect theory says, yeah, that makes some sense, but we do that under lots of uncertainty. And how do we do that? Not understanding what the exact result will be of certain outcomes. So we'll get into that as we go here. You can probably imagine that in order to do this in a research way, you would need to do experiments. So they do lots of experiments, and I'm going to talk to you about a few because we can do them together, or surveys of people. And it implies that humans make decisions maybe a little differently than we normally assume. So it's a little bit, sometimes it's controversial, one, just because you're taking on hundreds of years of economic theory, right? We're questioning some things that most economists and others have built their theories around. That is rational operators, maximization. The other area of potential controversy is that it could suggest there's a larger role for the state than some are comfortable with, because if we know humans will make these mistakes, maybe the government should nudge us in a different direction and try to get us to make a better decision. I'll show you a great example of that at the end. But the United Kingdom, within their government, their cabinet actually has a behavioral insights team that's built with behavioral economists, trying to find ways to help the British people make slightly different decisions that might better their lives. Some of them involve pollution, or saving energy, or saving more money, or not smoking. There's all kinds of implications for this. And this word nudge is the one that the economist from near Chicago, Thaler, came up with. He's saying he calls it libertarian paternalism. That is, we should always be allowed to choose whatever we want, but maybe we should be nudged in a certain direction. Another good example might be organ donation. Almost nobody signs the back of their license. Maybe we should just require signing, but if you want to opt out, then you can opt out, of course. It's always going to be your choice. But most of us want to do it. We just don't take the step of doing it, the signing or whatever is required. So behavioral economists might argue we should nudge us in the right direction, opt us into what most of us really should be doing, and make you opt out of the thing that probably isn't as good for you. And I'll show you a great example at the end of that. So it turns out that we make mistakes, most humans do, in certain areas. We're not very good at solving certain kinds of problems. Our minds don't work well in certain areas. And many of these are predictable, it turns out. If that's true, then we probably could design policies or come up with ways to try to mitigate them. And that's what I'm going to try to show you the rest of the way here. So in econ, so the title of my talk was Econs versus Humans. By an econ, I mean someone who carefully weighs costs and benefits of alternatives before making choices. We all do that to some extent, but maybe not in a perfect way, because many of us are really more like humans, right? We certainly use costs and benefits, but other things influence us. Like I made two lists of adjectives here. I think the first list, I think both of them have things that describe my personality in different ways, but clearly some in the first list do. Being impulsive, right? We do that sometimes. We can be short-sighted. That explains why we don't always save enough money. We can be emotional about decisions. An econ wouldn't behave that way. The actor in the textbook usually is analytics, reflective, deliberative, patient, makes good decisions because you always weigh your costs and benefits. So again, if we don't behave that way, let's think about how to deal with that and make things better. So the ones I bolded here are the ones I have time to talk about today. So one thing is we tend to rely too much on our past experience, what we know. Even though that's a very small part of the overall set of decisions, I bet a lot of people in Wisconsin invest in Wisconsin companies' stocks. Harley Davidson is probably popular. Well, that's a very narrow view, but it's what I know. I know they're a good company because I live around here, right? That's one way to think about that. We have these cognitive biases, and one of them is called an anchor, and that is our minds get anchored to certain things, and we have trouble deviating, and I'll show you some good examples that have been done in experiments. This one called loss aversion is a fascinating topic, but it turns out, and this has been replicated many times, we weigh losses way more than gains. That is, losing something makes us twice as miserable as gaining the same thing. So if you lose $1,000, you're very unhappy. If you gain 1,000, you're happy, but not nearly as happy as you were unhappy from losing. So losing is tough for people. And then we have this default bias. That is, we default to what we already have or already know. The one that says we have self-control problems. Well, I found this clock. This is an alarm clock. And not only does it ring, it then starts driving around your room. It has wheels. It drives off your table next to your bed, and it drives around your room. So you really have no choice but to get up, right? Because you have to chase it down. Well, if we didn't have self-control problems, we wouldn't need products like that, right? Because we would just get up when we're supposed to. And then people care about fairness. I think we just showed that. That fairness study or the ultimatum game shows that fairness influences much of what we do. So can we have too much choice? In economics, the answer usually is no, because choice is good, right? You want to have lots of options. So economists usually would say no, because our choice model says that we're better off having 5 options rather than 1 or 2, right? That's good to have. That's the whole idea of competition, right? We don't want to have just one supplier or product. We want to have lots of options, choices that makes them different. It usually leads to better prices, things like that. However, Medicare, prescription drug plan has like 1,000 options. Well, most people actually want less because it's confusing. Some just freeze up and don't do anything. There's a high cost to looking at them all, right? You have to put a lot of time into understanding it. So in many cases, we wish we had less options. I don't like going to this restaurant, the Cheesecake Factory, just because I don't like the menu. It's enormous. It's like 17 pages long. I don't really feel like having to, not that I have to, but I feel the need to when I go there, read through this thing. It's too big. I want less options. I want choices, though. I don't want 1 item. I don't want 3, but I also don't want 37. So it seems like people don't like too many choices, right? Because we get confused or we just don't put the time into it. That's similar in political campaigns. When you have too many candidates, the cost of researching them all becomes overwhelming, and people often just won't vote because they just don't know what to do or they don't want to put the time into it. Okay, so loss aversion is this term that says that losing is more painful than the benefit of gaining. And in another one of Lewis's books, in Moneyball, that was the book about Billy Beane, who was the general manager of the Oakland A's. And he says, I hate losing even more than I want to win. And that kind of summarizes this idea that people tend to weigh losses or even perceive losses more than gains. Losing something makes people roughly twice as miserable as the happiness from gaining the same thing. Here are 2 examples of how psychologists have shown this. So imagine one experiment where 50 people are invited to do this experiment, maybe in a hotel ballroom. And when they arrive, half of them are given a coffee mug. The other half are given some cash. And then they sit down. The people that are given the coffee mug are asked to write down the value of how much they value this mug they've just been given and what they would sell it for. And then the people who are given money are asked to try to bid on mugs. Every time you do this, those who are given the mugs, I put some numbers up there, tend to value the mugs about twice as much as those who are trying to buy them from them. What explains that? They're no different. They're the same people. They were just randomly picked. Well, once you've been given something, selling is like losing it. So it's theirs now, right? So they don't mean leave without a mug anymore. But they value it now because it's theirs. So losing it is painful. But those who don't already have it, I'll pay for it, but I'm not going to go nuts here, right? Here's what it's worth. You don't want to sell it to me, fine. A better example is Duke basketball, because they play, if you don't know, they play in this pretty small stadium. And so all students can't go to games even if they wanted to. So the way they allocate tickets, the way they ration tickets, is the students first have to camp out overnight the night before the game. And then if they do that, there's a lottery, and they randomly pick students who get to go. So the beauty of that experiment is that they all must really want to go because they all took the step of camping out overnight. So clearly all want to go. But also they don't all get them. So only let's say half the students get the tickets. A well-known economist called Dan Ariely, I'll show you his book later, he then He also writes in the Wall Street Journal quite a bit. He then did an experiment where he called up those who got the tickets and asked them, what would you sell them for? And in his book, he says most of them said there's no money, Professor Lilly. I wouldn't sell them for anything. And he said that's ridiculous, right? 30,000, okay, 20. It came down to being something like 8-10 grand is how much they valued the tickets that they were given to this game. Those who didn't get them but stayed overnight and wanted to go, he called them and interviewed them, and they said, yeah, I would pay up to a couple $100, but if I can't buy one, I'm gonna go to a sports bar and watch it. That'd be okay too. There was a massive difference between those who were allocated tickets and what they would sell them for versus those who didn't get them, what they would buy them for. And that seems irrational because they were the same pot of students who all stayed overnight and who all really wanted to go. The only explanation that you come up with is that it must be this loss aversion. Once you got the tickets and you think you're going, like tonight to the Bucks game, if you think you're going tonight to Game 6 and someone offers you money, it's going to be hard to give that up because you, in your mind, you're going, right? To not go and go home and watch it on TV means I lose something. For the person who doesn't have them and is bidding on them, they don't get it. They didn't lose anything. They just never got the thing they were hoping to get. So I think that makes some sense. But it's important because it has implications for investments as well, right? Loss aversion. We probably should sell certain stocks or bonds when they're, even if you might lose some money, right? If they're going to lose more. I'll show you some examples there. Okay, here's again where I could use some participation. So I want you to, I'm going to show you two scenarios. And in each one, there'll be an A or a B option. I want you to jot down first in scenario 1, do you want A or B? And then in scenario 2, do you want A or B? And then once we've done that, I'm going to ask you to share either AA, AB, BA, BB, whatever, in the chat so I can see your responses. So here are my scenarios. The first one says, in addition to whatever you own, you've been given $1,000. So now you have been asked to choose between one of these two options. So you're going to get 1,000 for sure. Now, option A is, do you want a 50-50 chance to win another 1,000? So you get 2,000 or 1,000, 50-50 chance of 2,000, 50-50 chance you just get the 1,000. Or option B is, would you prefer 500 for sure? Which of those do you want? Hang on, Hannah. Well, I need you to write down. I want you to do both. Once you've seen them both, I want to see your choices for scenario 1 and scenario 2. So for scenario 1, the option is $1,000 for sure. And then do you want a 50-50 chance at 1,000 more, or you might get no more, or do you want 500 for sure? So A or B. So I preferably just jot that down next to you where you are right now. Do you want A or B in scenario 1? Scenario 2 says you've been given $2,000, and now you must choose. Do you want a 50-50 chance to lose $1,000, or do you want to lose 500 for sure? So now I would like to see you type into the chat either your two responses. What do you want for scenario 1, A or B? What do you want for scenario 2, A or B? Put them both together. So AA I see here.
And I'm seeing AA. Some folks just selected B, so I don't know if they're saying that that's what they want for both.
I see a BA. I see Marlena. So Hannah said B, comma A. I don't know what Marlena said for scenario 1. I see scenario 2, she wanted B. Oh, she wanted A and then B. Okay, so I see A and then B. You're making my life harder. I would like to see 2 letters together, but that's okay. I'm working with you. Do you have any more?
Say, Hannah has B for both.
Okay, I see Marty has BA. Okay, that's good. So I'm going to say this carefully because somebody did this. No one should have written 2 different letters. That would not make any sense. And here's why I say that. In both scenarios, option A is $1,000 and you gamble 50-50 to win 2,000. That's the same in option A, scenario 1, as in scenario 2. It's just written differently, right? There you're given a 2,000, you're losing money, but option A in both cases is you keep 1,000 for sure, and there's a 50-50 chance you get 1,000 more. They're the identical offer, just expressed differently. And option B is identical too. It's in both cases, it's a sure 1,500. No gamble. So option A is a gamble, 50-50, 2,000, 50-50, 1,000. Option B in both cases is no gamble. I want 1,500 for sure. See, it's just expressed differently here. you're losing 500. So it doesn't make any sense that someone would, it turns out most people do, turns out, so most prefer option B in scenario 1, the sure 1,500, and most want to gamble in option 2. So that most people choose BA, and we had a couple of those. Hannah did that, for example. But really, they're identical. So why would we do this? Well, one might be loss aversion. In scenario 2, it's a sure loss of 500. That's pretty painful for people, right? You're kind of saying, just take 500 away from me. It's not even a gamble, right? It's just a sure loss. People often struggle with that. Regret, right? Maybe if you don't try for more, you're going to regret it. What the Kahneman and Tversky, the two psychologists, say is that we're just not very good at probability. Our mind doesn't work in odds. And I've been thinking a little bit about it with the pandemic too, right? Because we didn't want to, we stopped flying. We were scared of the virus, but that made us drive more. And the most dangerous thing I do every day is drive my car, right? So we've had many more fatalities on the roads. People weren't flying. Certainly many more fatalities in the roads exceeded what would have happened because of the virus. So it's not super rational to want to drive more because driving is actually very, very dangerous. But we're not, I shouldn't say very, very, of the things most of us do every day, it is the most dangerous thing we do, right? It's the best chance of being hurt or even killed. But we don't think about it that way. So, but in math, if A is better than B, B can't be better than A. But that's kind of what many people will respond here. And again, I think it's because, again, loss aversion plays into it as well as, thinking about probability. So kind of an interesting way to think about stuff there. We feel more pain of loss if we think we were close to avoiding the loss. So Dan Ariely, he's at Duke. He did that study I told you about the tickets. He says happiness really depends not on where we are at the moment, but how easy we perceive we might have been elsewhere in another better situation. Like they did a study in airports and they interviewed folks who missed their flight. And they had a misery index. So they had to check off how miserable you are. If you missed by 45 minutes, you picked high. People picked high generally. If you missed by 1 minute, they picked very high. That makes no sense though. You missed your flight, right? Either way, you missed your flight. There is no difference in the outcome for you, whether you missed by a minute or 2 hours, you missed your flight. But I totally get it, right? You come running up there, you were so close. But what is so close being, right? Either way, you missed your flight. So this one more example of people lost aversion, right? You lost something and you were super close to getting it. It makes it even more miserable. People whose stock portfolios rise from $1 million to $1.5 million are more happy than those whose portfolios fall from 3 to 2.5. I guess that makes sense, but I'd much prefer to be at person number 2 there, right? You have $1 million more. But again, they lost some. Even though they're wealthier, they've lost something. So loss aversion seems to be a real concept. Okay. So let's keep going. Hang on, a little hung up here with my slide. Oh, there we go. So what are some implications of this, like in business? One might be, marketing people know this, so they try to emphasize losses because people really respond to that. So instead of saying how much time you'll save, if you don't buy our new fast cooking oven, you'll lose hours of time baking. So you're going to lose something. Or a bank might say you'll lose $100 a year in fees if you don't switch to our no fee checking account. Rather than trying to emphasize the gain, the losses people respond to. Another area might be like the HR area or change. People hate losses, not change. We always hear people don't like change. What these guys, research has shown is that people actually don't like loss. So in the human resource department, let's say you're having trouble affording a benefit, rather than eliminating it, you're better off scaling things back. People don't like to lose things. Or maybe you're having a tough year, don't eliminate the Christmas party, just ratchet it back a little bit so it's not as expensive. That's at least the advice they give, is that people really hate losses. And then in the investment world, I think this partly explains people keep stocks too long, hoping they'll rebound. They don't want to take a loss. Or on a home, right? If you're trying to sell your house, the price you paid for your house is really irrelevant. It only matters to you, right? Nobody else cares. But people have a hard time selling for less than they paid, even if it might be smart, because it might fall further, right? And the stock as well, maybe you should sell it at a loss because that certainly makes sense. It's going to fall further. But this idea of a loss is very hard for people to get over. That, hey, I own this, I shouldn't have to take a loss on it. Okay, Another concept I think that might be useful is called anchoring. And this is a bias that describes the tendency to rely too much on the first or most familiar piece of information we've got. So here's one example, a local example for us is I saw a study done where people were interviewed and asked how big is Milwaukee in population. They interviewed like 100 people from Chicago, and the average guess they gave was 1,000,000. And when they asked them why, they were thinking to themselves, well, I know how big Chicago is. That's where I live. That's my anchor. It's about 3,000,000. I know Milwaukee's smaller. It seems about a third as big. I'm going to guess 1,000,000. So that's the way they reasoned it out. So their anchor was Chicago. Even though the size of Chicago, the size of Milwaukee have nothing to do with each other, really. They're not related, other than the fact that they knew where they lived, their anchor, and they knew Milwaukee was smaller. They did the same with people from Green Bay, and they did the same kind of math. They said, I know that Milwaukee's bigger. I know that Green Bay is about 100,000. It seems 3 times bigger. I'm going to guess 300,000. And that was a very common guess of Green Bay residents. And the answer is actually dead between. So the anchor threw them both off, right? The anchor wasn't very helpful to them because what they knew didn't give them a lot of good information about what they were trying to guess at, but it makes a lot of sense. They're anchored to what they know. And I do that myself. I live in Wauwatosa here. When I go other places, I think to myself, how big is Columbus, Ohio? I don't know. It seems kind of like Milwaukee. My boys go to 2 of my boys go to college in Cincinnati. Turns out it is about the same size, and it seems that way, right? My anchor is how big is Milwaukee. I compare it to other things, so that makes sense. But it can throw us off. This is a very fun example, though. This ad really occurred in The Economist magazine. So The Economist was selling just online subscriptions for $59 for a year, or just print for $125, or print and web for $125. Now, one of those 3 seems irrational, like you would never buy it. I'm guessing the middle one, right? No one could imagine why they would do that. Doesn't make any sense. So did The Economist make a mistake? The answer is no, and I'll show you what they were getting at here. So again, this one, here, let me use this. I mean, this one really doesn't, hang on. I'm trying to use the annotation tool, but I'm having trouble with it. Oh, here we go. This one shouldn't make much sense, right? Because if you want print, you might as well print and web for the same price. But let me show you what happened. So a study was done. They actually used MIT students, and they showed them that ad. And as you might imagine, nobody wanted option B. Why would you? It doesn't make any sense. So in this initial study, 84% chose option C, which was both, and then 16% chose option A, which was just online, and nobody wanted option B. But look what happens when you remove option B. Then instead, 68% chose just online, and only 32% wanted print and web. The economists obviously prefer to sell the more expensive option, right? So what in our language of what we're doing this morning, that middle one's like an anchor. That's a pretty good deal, 125. I should do that and get web, right? It's making you think to yourself, that gives me a better deal. So the economists made more money. They got more people to choose print and web than otherwise would have done it by putting in that sort of goofy middle one that nobody was choosing. So I guess you could say that's it's kind of like marketing, advertising, taking advantage of us. But I would also say it's an example of this idea of anchoring. And I think that explains other stuff, like why do charities give you this range of donation suggestions? Because they're anchoring in your mind that anything less than the lowest one is insulting, right? What do you mean? If you gotta write a different number in, that's what you have to do, right? I'm gonna give 50, and instead you have to write that number in. They're anchoring in, you're trying to anchor to you that below 100 is too little. I was just in Las Vegas over the prior weekend for a meeting. It's 117 degrees, by the way. It was ridiculous. You couldn't even use the outdoor escalators. They had signs saying don't touch the hand sides. They were so hot they'd burn your skin. But in New York, I took a Vegas cab, did the same thing. The average tip for many years in a New York cab was 8.7%. Then they started suggesting, their machine started suggesting tips, and this is what they suggested, 20, 25, or 30, and miraculously, average was 22%. But that when I was in Las Vegas, that was the exact same thing. It was 20, 25, 30. I did write in 15, by the way, because I paid what I wanted. But many think, oh, that's kind of, it must be that 20 is insulting, or to go below that's kind of insulting. But people must tip 20 and above here in New York, where I'm not from. So I'm gonna use those. But really, they're trying to anchor in your mind that the 20% is the low end. You got to pick something above that. This one, I've never seen it done, but I've read about it, and it's hard for me to believe. But I'm gonna tell it. I'll explain to you what's been written about many times and has occurred. Our Social Security numbers are completely random, so they're a random number, especially the last 4 digits. So the experiment that's been done is, again, you invite a group in, and the first thing you ask them to do is just write down the last 4 digits of the Social Security number. So mine would be 1847. 1847. That's the last 4 digits. It's been randomly assigned to me when I was born, right? That's what it is. There's nothing significant about those last 4 digits. And then they bring out stuff and they ask the whole group after them this, how much would you bid for like a fancy bottle of wine, do a little auction. Then they say, how much would you bid for this not so fancy bottle of wine, do a little auction. Then they bring out some chocolates and they do a little auction. And amazingly, people with the lower numbers, so the lower security numbers like between 0 and 19, their average bid is 67. As the numbers get bigger, maybe it's the last 2 digits what they ask you to write down went up. And then as they get higher, they bid more. They've done the same thing by having you spin a roulette wheel and then write down the number you get and then go to an auction. Oddly enough, it appears there's an anchoring effect even with random numbers. So just the act of writing down a bigger number influences future bidding because this bigger number is in your mind for some reason. I know that's the one I would have to see that occur because it doesn't make any sense to me. But it's been replicated by well-known researchers, so it seems to be the case. The other one I'm going to talk about at the end here is default bias. So people tend to stick with the option they've been given and not change. So I'm going to show you 2 scenarios here, and you read each of these paragraphs, and then I'll ask you some questions in the chat. So here's the first one. So just read option 1 first. Okay, so everybody should have read that. It's a common thing you might encounter at a new job related to your retirement plan, your 401k. Now just read option 2. Okay, so I'll ask 3 questions. The first one I'll answer, then I'll ask you to use the chat. Are the 2 offers the same? Yeah, they're the same monetarily. They're saying you can deduct the same amount, put into account. There's no difference in terms of monetarily what the offer is. And I would say yes to number 2. They communicate the same information. This is the plan. This is how you get into it. This is what HR does. But here's my question for you. Do you think it will matter in terms of participation which way it's presented? So I guess you could write in a yes or no, and then which one you think is going to give us, which one will give us more participation, do you think? Option 1 or option 2? So Victor says yes, option 2. So opting in should influence it. Donna says yes, option 1. I think you probably meant option 2 would give us more, though. Anybody else have an opinion? Yeah, when you're automatically opted in, your percent participating will increase. Okay, yep, that's the stuff saying, okay, yep, and that is what happened. Again, though, that's, I'm not going to say irrational, but it doesn't make a ton of sense because either way, if you wanted to be in, it was very easy to be in, right? So it really was just what's called default bias, although you also might refer to it as laziness, right? You just didn't go and do it. But you had a huge difference, it turns out. When we did automatically enroll, about 37% of Americans were in their 401ks. When we changed to automatic enrollment, almost 86% did. That is pretty drastic if you think about that. That's 50% of people who had to be opted in to do it, even though everyone I think knows they should be doing it, or most of us understand that, right? We should be saving. So, and that's the most famous behavioral economics example because Richard Thaler, the guy in Chicago, he showed these results to the federal government, and the Congress actually changed law. And they changed the law to say that your employer now may opt you in. They must let you opt out, of course, But it used to be, before Thaler's research, that we had to opt ourselves in. We were by default not in. Now many firms, many big companies opt you in, and then if you want to get out, sure, of course, fill the paperwork out and do that. But it actually hasn't had a real impact on American savings rate. So that's kind of a cool example of behavioral economics actually having a financial impact on people. And he called that a nudge. So I'll show you what I mean, because he's nudging us in the right direction. So my last video is actually Thaler discussing what a nudge is.
Let me give you an illustration of a nudge. It's funny. It's one paragraph in our book, but it's by far the most famous example from the book. It turns out some genius, an economist in fact, allegedly at least, an economist who works for the Amsterdam International Airport Schiphol, got the brilliant idea to etch the image of a housefly in the urinals in the men's bathrooms. This image of a housefly, it looks extremely realistic. You can see a picture of it on our website, nudges.org. And it's located just near the drain. Now, it turns out that men, when they're taking care of their business, they're not fully attending to the task at hand. But, and I'm sure there's an evolutionary explanation for this, if you give them a target, they will aim. And according to the people who run the airport, spillage has been reduced by 80%. Now, that housefly has become my favorite illustration of a nudge. So what's a nudge? A nudge is some small feature of the environment that attracts our attention and alters our behavior.
So I'll leave you with, if you want a little more, there's some interesting books. And I think the best one probably for maybe high school students or even for teachers who just want to be introduced to this would be Thaler's book called Nudge. So he goes through all kinds of examples, and they're all familiar and kind of short paragraphs, but they're all, short chapters, but they're all very interesting. Some are environmental, some try to reduce people littering in parks. A lot of stuff that you would think work that we do has no effect, but there's some simple things you can do that actually change behavior. I don't remember the exact details, but one great example has to do with, everybody knows they should probably turn off their lights at night and not waste energy and things like that. So sometimes there's different ways we try to tell people that. One is just through campaigns. We might put on our bill, you could be saving money if you didn't use so much power at night. None of those seem to have any impact. However, if customers are told that their neighbors are saving money and their neighbors aren't wasting energy, that really bothers you. And you don't like being compared to somebody else who's doing a better job than you by turning off lights at night, then you'll do it more, is what he showed. They have some scheme for where they said, hey, the houses around you actually use X less energy at night. Basically, what are you doing? And people change their behavior when they realized they were the outlier. They felt like they were being ostracized. So it's an interesting book. It could definitely be used in a class because it's very readable and simple to understand them. The one about organ donation is in there. The 401k is in there. Lots of different examples. So Dan Ariely, the next book there called Predictably Irrational. You kind of get the title there. It's that people are irrational sometimes, and we know what is going to happen. I showed you some great examples of when it happens all the time. So he shows a bunch of different examples, including that Duke basketball thing I showed you with the coffee cups. The third one, I would say not accessible to students for sure. It's a bit of a tomb. It's Daniel Kahneman, who's really the founder of all this stuff. It's kind of his opus of his life, but it probably has 10,000 citations in it. It's very meticulous in terms of the research he did over time. So unless you want to be a scholar of this stuff, you probably don't need that. Thaler wrote one called Misbehaving, interesting book. And I love Michael Lewis anyway, because if it isn't clear, I thought, The Big Short was a fantastic book and movie. I love Moneyball. I love The Blind Side. They're all really good, and this is an equally good. I wouldn't be shocked if it became a movie at some point. It's really more of a story of how we got behavioral economics through these people, but their lives are fascinating because of where they grew up and ended up participating in a number of conflicts that Israel was involved with in the Middle East, and they would use their psychology knowledge to help the Israeli army assign jobs to people and things like that, which is kind of interesting. But then just kind of how they work together and had this kind of dynamic relationship that led to all this research and all these studies that are now well known among everybody. They coined all these terms I use today. It really came from Kahneman and a guy named Amos Tversky. So the last thing I was going to say is that even the NFL has been influenced by behavioral economics. So Thaler has been a consultant for the Cleveland Browns. And if you follow the NFL, you might know they went from being among the worst teams in the league to actually making the playoffs last year. They were 0-16. This headline says 7-8-1. Last year, I think they went 9-7 and finally made the playoffs. And he gave them a few pieces of advice. Some seem kind of obvious. One is that he argues for trading down in the first round for a few reasons. The first is that second round players aren't that much worse than first round players, so you're not giving up a ton. Secondly, you have to pay guys you draft early way more money, but more importantly, more picks is good because it's essentially not quite random, but darn close to it. No one really knows it's going to work out, so picking more is good. He also says that teams have an incentive to pick this year because they want to go to the media and go to their fans and say, hey, we're getting better. So they'll give up way more to get this year's pick in the future. So you could trade this year's pick and get a lot next year. So he advocates doing that. And if you follow the NFL, the Browns did that a few times. He says never trade high future picks to move up in this draft because, again, they're overvalued this year because everybody wants to go in front of the media, in front of their fans and say, hey, I picked. He said if you can get over that, you can get huge benefits in the future. So it's sort of another behavioral implication. All right, so we can use a chat, or Aaron, if you think we want to unmute, do that too. But I'll do whatever we want. But if you have a few questions, we have time for that, and then we could maybe take a break and move to the other session.
So I just unmuted everyone. So if you don't want to talk, if you can go ahead and mute yourself, but this gives folks the ability to be able to chime in with questions.
Drainage. For snoring, there's a variety of procedures that we have. Many instances.
Always risky unmuting in the webinar. Obviously, I can read the chat too, so or later too, and I can definitely share with Erin whatever I've used today if that's helpful, and she can get it if that's possible. Erin, do you have a way to be able to share my slides, or is that not possible?
Yep, we can send those out after the presentation today.
Okay. Well, I'm not seeing any questions. Maybe we should do our little break, and then we'll come back together for talk about the macro economy and how COVID affected it.
Sounds good. What do you think? 5 minutes, Scott? 10 minutes?
Maybe it's just before. How about 10:05? So that'll get like 6 minutes, I guess, right?
Sounds good. See everyone in 6 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Of the co-op student.
Does that look okay, Aaron? Aaron or Cheryl, can you see my slide up again?
Hi, sorry. It's running to get coffee.
No, that's fine.
Yes, I can see your slide. Looks
Okay.
good.
Okay.
At the end, Scott, we're going to do a couple of prizes, and we were thinking about giving away your book. Teachers Can Be Financially Fit. Is that okay with you?
That's great. Thank you. I appreciate that.
And is ordering it through Amazon the best way to do that for you, or is there a different way that you prefer to do that?
No, that's good. The other way is through Spring of the Publisher, but it's the same price and Amazon's way more convenient, so I would just do that.
Okay, thank you.
I'm actually I'm somehow the Whitewater School District learned about it, and I'm the speaker at their back to school faculty workshop, and they're going to buy books for all their teachers. That'll be kind of fun.
That's cool.
That'll be fun. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna grab some water. I'll be right back. We have a couple minutes.
Yep, go for it. Cheryl, did you have any announcements you wanted to make at any point?
No, actually pretty quiet right now. We're just I'm getting stuff ready and prepared for the start of the school year. So my main thing is FAFSA completion, but I don't think that's going to fit this group pretty well. So all good.
All right, it's 10:05, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. And before Scott gets into the second half of his presentation, wanted to mention that we will be giving away some prizes at the end of Scott's session today. So I know you'll all want to stay on because this will be super interesting. But if you need an extra push, stay on because you could win Scott's book that he put out. That he talked about a little bit earlier, Teachers Can Be Financially Fit. So we'll be giving away 2 copies of that book for folks who stay on until the end. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Scott.
Great, thanks, Aaron. Are you able to re-mute? I get a little feedback over there. I don't know if it's people are off mute there, but not a big deal.
I have everyone muted on my end, so if folks can, if you see an option to be able to mute yourself further in some way, please go ahead and mute yourselves now.
Okay, no, that's great. Okay, thanks. So I hope that was useful the first session. I know that in fact both Wisconsin's econ and personal finance standards talk about decision making, and on the personal finance side, it's about how we make decisions and that kind of thing, usually about money, of course. But I hope behavioral econ gives you a little bit of a perspective into that and might be useful for you as you teach. The second thing we're going to do now, though, is clearly practical. It's really looking at what's been going on in the U.S. economy, and I always find the best way to do that is to kind of center the discussion around the three big indicators, and it's a little bit technical along the way here. I think some cases it's kind of very interesting, and some things you maybe haven't seen before. The inflation world is a big deal right now if you follow the news, and the way it's measured, there are more than one way to measure it, and I think it's important for teachers to know that, so I'm going to show you that, even though it gets a little bit technical. We'll look at that for a few minutes. I've got some fun visuals that you could use in class for sure. And then we'll end by looking at what unemployment looks like right now. So we'll start with GDP. If we were together, I'd ask you to tell me what it is, but most of you probably know it's essentially the production of all goods and services in the U.S. economy. The very technical definition is it's the value of all final goods and services. So final meaning you don't want to double count things. So you don't want to count a car and the radio and the tires. You just count the final thing, the car, because the price of the car reflects all the components within it. And then in a country, so produced in a country, so while many American companies produce outside the nation, particularly car companies in Windsor, Ontario, they would be in Canadian GDP. So, and then Toyota is not an American company, but it produces in Kentucky, other places, it would be in GDP. So it's produced in the United States. The idea being that then you employ Americans, and it gives you a sense of the economy for us, for those of us who live here. And we often do it quarterly, and I'll show you some charts, some actually kind of crazy charts about what GDPs look like in the recent experience. It's like the big indicator of how healthy the economy is. We just went through a very, very short recession, 2 months long about, 2 quarters long, I mean, about. So a recession is normally, that's the minimum. It would be 2 quarters in a row of declining GDP. And we had one of those last year, very short, and we appear to be out of it now. And then we often look at it as a growth rate. So this is a graph that if you would have shown it to me a year and a half ago, I said it's not possible. But if you look over here, this is the pandemic. So this is the first quarter of last year, we had some decline in GDP. But when we shut the economy down, we had like a 30% contraction. This is the second quarter of last year, and then a massive snapback in the third quarter, and then it's been growing pretty quickly in the quarters since. The latest we have is the first quarter of this calendar year. So normally you can see here, this is normally somewhere around maybe 2% growth, but we had this huge fluctuation due to a pandemic, which, like I said, if I would have seen this and not known what happened, I would have thought this can't be possible. We can't have, the U.S. economy would never contract by 30% in a quarter and then expand by 30% in the next quarter. The prior recession, this is the one that was driven by housing, you probably remember, in the 08-09 time period. So again, 2 quarters in a row. So we had declining GDP in like 5 or 6 quarters over this time period here. And this is the one that many of you might be too young to remember much about, but it was when President Bush, the second Bush, took office. We had a very short recession. It was right after 9/11. We had an Enron crisis. We had a dot-com crisis in the stock market. Those things sort of drove a very mild and short recession that we had back then. So that's what it's looked like over time. I don't want to bore you with technical things, but when we think about GDP, we usually divide it into different categories. So we look at consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Consumption is what you and I buy, so household spending. Investment is business spending. We know what government spending is. And then net exports is interesting because we want to include the exports because Americans built them, but we subtract the imports because we may buy them into the consumption category, but we didn't make them, so they need to come out of our GDP. So the way the Bureau of Economic Analysis does this is they add up these categories and get the imports subtracted out, and you should end up at a pretty good estimate. Turns out that number is last year was about $21 trillion, which is very hard for the human mind, much less a high school student mind to understand. But it's very, very big, the biggest economy in the world. China's super close, but don't forget that China does it with, 1 billion people, and we do it with 330 million or so much wealthier per person. But given that massive number, I thought I came up with an analogy I think you might find useful in class. I'll just show it to you here. So, how big is a trillion? Well, when you don't know what a word means, you usually go to the dictionary. So I did that, and it's not very helpful though. So Webster Dictionary says it's a really, really big number. That's true. The second definition Webster's has is a billion. A trillion is 1,000 billion. Well, let's think about that in time perspective. So millions, that's big too. A million seconds ago, that would be 12 days ago, okay, in time. A billion seconds ago would have been 32 years ago. And then, of course, if you're following my math, a trillion seconds ago would be 32,000 years ago. So I think students sometimes, and all of us get confused between billions and trillions. They're all huge, but they aren't close, right? They're off by 1,000 times. That's like saying in U.S. history class something happened 32 years ago or 32,000 years ago. Those units are not similar. So trillions are huge. So the U.S. economy is measured in trillions, 21 about trillion. It'll be bigger than that this year, certainly, given the growth we've had. Yeah, Victor gave us how many zeros there are. And take 3 off, you get a billion. 3 more off, you get a million. So it's 1,000 times. But trillions 1,000 times a billion, even though billions are big, but trillions are 1,000 times bigger. So consumption is the biggest category in our GDP, is 2/3 of it. So it's durable goods, like stuff that lasts, like buying cars. You might know my oldest son, Patrick, he was home in May because his lease started in June at the university he goes to. But he needed to buy a used car because he has an internship now, and I got 4 kids, and 3 of them drive, so he's not taking one of mine anymore. So he bought a Nissan Sentra, but I can't tell you, used cars, I think at the month he was buying it in May, were up like 17% for the month. So used cars have really gone up in price for a reason we'll think about a little bit later. Non-durable goods would be like food, toiletries, stuff like that. And then, of course, services are part of GDP because they create income for people. So that could be going to get your haircut, or an accountant, or any kind of service you might go to. Now, I made this chart. It's kind of interesting. It shows you, so the red is food that Americans buy in stores. So food and liquor, basically, in grocery stores. That's what this is. And the blue is the same thing, food and liquor, but purchased in, it says, drinking places. So like restaurants. So right before the pandemic, if you look around here, we spent about half our money on food and drinking at home, grocery stores, and about half going out, which I'm not sure I knew that about myself, but as I reflect on it, it might be true, but it's quite a bit more expensive to go out. We don't go out as much, but we spend more when we do, so that might be true. When the pandemic hit, you can see that spending on food in grocery stores went way up. Spending on food in bars and restaurants went way down, and they've now come back closer, but there's still this gap here, right? So they're not back to even. But what I think is interesting about this chart, you all knew this happened, but the whole point of economic data is that it reflects human behavior, like what we actually did. And this is what we did, right? You and I lived this, and now the data reflects it. That is, we stopped going to restaurants, that's this. We started buying more food at grocery stores, that's this. And we've gotten closer to more normal times today. So that's the idea on that chart. I think it shows you one consumption category, of course, is food. And that category went through a wild gyration last year. This is travel, so this is miles traveled. And you can see, again, right when the pandemic hit, all kinds of travel. So the green is flying, the red is rail, and the blue is driving. They all went way down, right? Almost to zero, like in the March timeframe of a year ago. Last summer, the blue one, which is car travel, ratcheted way back fast, which is, again, the experience. You want to go on driving trips. They felt safe doing that. They often went to national parks. Airlines have been coming back, but took much longer. I don't know much about rail. I mean, I've done very little rail travel beyond going to Chicago. But it's been declining over time, and it's still way below its norm. The other interesting thing about this graph is if you look at the blue line driving, he's got this every year it's doing this thing. That's because of the seasonal effect. We drive a lot more in the summer and a lot less in the winter. And then you can see spikes every time for like Thanksgiving and Christmas, right? That's what you really see in that graph. That driving in the U.S. is very seasonal, and then has these spikes for the holidays. But nonetheless, it went way down last spring, came back fast last summer, and it's about in the same place now. Okay, but again, transportation is a component of consumption. Investment is business spending, so if they build a new factory, new machinery, new equipment. If you and I build a new home, that's the only thing you and I would ever buy that would be in investment. If we built a new home, not selling a current home, but building a new home, that falls into investment as well. And this is a picture of housing starts. So not surprisingly, they went way down in the last recession because that was a housing fueled recession. So we overbuilt and home builders cut way back. What's interesting this time, though, is that when the pandemic hit this time, home builders thought we wouldn't want to buy houses because we got this terrible economy going on. So they cut way back on building new homes, but they were wrong. We actually wanted to buy homes. We wanted to buy new homes. We wanted to move. And we wanted to move out away from people in some cases, or get something bigger because you spend so much time with your family. People wanted bigger homes. So this actually shows that, and as you probably know now, home prices are through the roof. And that's because there's a shortage. And that shortage came about because home builders cut way back on production, thinking, well, the economy looks terrible. That makes a lot of sense. No one's going to want to buy a house right now, right? That's the last thing people want. Turned out they were completely wrong. That's just what people wanted, was to buy houses. And they wanted to move, especially into bigger homes or away from big cities. So that they've tried to come back and build, and they have. So we come back there too. So a component of investment is new housing construction, and this picture shows what this looked like over time. And then government spending, of course, is at all levels, municipal, state, local, state, and federal. And I just want to be careful that you know that in GDP, it's only the government spending parts on goods and services. So things like I put pictures of what you do, teaching, teaching services, that's part of GDP. You guys produce education, so do I. Building roads and bridges is in GDP. That's a drone, so national defense is in GDP. But not stuff, the government spends most of its money on programs, like Social Security, for example. That's the biggest government program in the world. It's a $1.1 trillion program a year. But nothing's getting produced, no GDP. That's just moving money from you and I who work through taxes to those who are retired. So no GDP is being produced by transferring money. So when we say government spending, we mean the spending on goods and services, not all the spending we do through different unemployment programs or welfare, things like that. Those are not in GDP. And then net exports is exports minus imports. And I made a picture of that, the United States. Notice my graph here. This is zero. So these are all trade deficits. That is, we import more than we export. And even though we've been putting it, especially under President Trump, putting a number of tariffs on things, the trade gap actually has gotten bigger. The deficit's actually gotten bigger. This is probably explained here because the U.S. economy has recovered much faster than much of the world. So we're back to importing lots of stuff again from abroad as our economy has gotten stronger. The U.S. has a lot of exporting. We just do more importing, it turns out. This is not because we don't export. After China, we're the biggest exporter in the world. We're just the world's biggest importers, is what you see here. And then this is just from the Wall Street Journal. Last year, the economy contracted by about 3.5%, but not everything contracted. So where do we contract? Places like healthcare, which sounds weird, but you know that. Nobody did anything elective last year, right? No one had surgeries or things that weren't required. Definitely recreation and transportation contracted. But some things expanded last year. You might know people tried to buy durable goods. People tried to remodel their homes. People tried to buy new stoves and ovens and things. So that stuff really kind of boomed last year, whereas service-related stuff really contracted. So that just shows you food food spending out, for example, fell by 1.02%. So certain things contracted, certain things expanded, but in the end, last year's economy really shrunk overall. Okay, so again, this is hard to do in a chat, but let's do it anyway. So I'm going to read to you these categories, and you tell me in the chat, your answer you'll give me either is consumption, C, investment, I, government spending, G, or how about NX for net exports? So you're answering my questions. My first one is, so what category of GDP would the purchase of a 2014 used Honda Accord fall into? Is it C, I, G, NX, or is it none of those? So hopefully in the chat you can give me an answer. Oh, no one wants to be the first answerer. You know what? I'll do the first one. It's a trick. So you guys are thinking C, but it's not C. I'm seeing some C's come up. No used goods. So I said 2020 GDP, but 2014 Accord. That Accord was in 2014's GDP, and it will never be in GDP again. So no, that was actually meant to be a trick. Let's do an easier one. Last week we were doing our programs in Green Bay. We stayed at a hotel called Lodge Kohler. What a great place. What if they build a hotel in Door County? What would that fall under? C, I, G, or NX? So Kohler builds a new hotel. If you've seen the answer to Aaron, just let me know.
Paula says I. Connie
Connie
says
says
I.
And you guys are right. Yeah. So it's business spending. Let's just do one more. What if I in next April need to see my accountant for tax advice? What does that fall under? C, I, G, or NX?
Paula says C.
Yep, right. So it's a service consumption. Yep. If a government buys police cars, that's a government spending, of course. If we build a new home, that falls in investment. My current home that I'm sitting in right now in Wauwatosa was built in, I think, 1931, so during the Great Depression. But won't be in GDP again, though. It was in GDP then. If I built, we actually did build an addition many years ago, or if I remodel, of course, that's in GDP, but not the house. It's in GDP the year it's constructed. Okay, there are some limitations, though, and I kind of mentioned a few. One of them is the underground sector. We don't count things like drugs or prostitution in GDP, yet they're big sectors. This chart I just put there shows you the GDP would be significantly bigger if we did try to estimate the amount of illegal drug sales or other illegal activities, but we don't do this. We don't count underground sector. That even includes things like if your son or daughter babysits for cash, technically they're creating childcare services that should be in GDP, but unless you send a W-9 at the end of the year, that's not going to be counted. And then stuff you do yourself. So if you paint your own house, it's not going to be in GDP. But if you hire a painter, then it will be. The paint will be either way, but not the labor part unless you hire someone to do it. Or if you have a garden, we don't count your tomatoes as part of GDP, but we would if you bought them at Pick and Save. So no homemaker stuff. And then the other thing we're struggling with is what do you do about the fact that a lot of things you and I consume, services, we don't pay for. Like the Google map on my phone, I love it, but I don't pay for it directly, right? So it's creating a service, but how do we value that? The government's been trying things like Facebook is the best example. Lots of people use it, no one pays for it directly, yet clearly it's contributing to GDP. What they've been thinking about is they could use the advertising revenue that it produces or the employee salaries. Advertising revenue probably makes the most sense. So that's how they've been trying to measure that. This map might be useful in class. This just shows you how big the US economy is. So we equate different states with different countries. For example, Canada's economy is 1.73 trillion, which is actually slightly smaller than that of Texas. So Texas and Canada have a similar size economy. I think this one sort of amazes me. I mean, I know I've been in Florida; it's a big state, but I've also been in Mexico. It's an enormous country that has tourism and manufacturing. The Mexican economy is bigger than Florida's, but not by much. That's the closest equivalent to Florida is Mexico. So I think that's kind of remarkable. That gets you at what 21 trillion means. So Wisconsin and Singapore have a similar size economy. This one's interesting for students. You know, Saudi Arabia has all the oil, so everybody thinks they must be so wealthy. Well, they don't produce. They produce less GDP than the state of Pennsylvania is able to produce. So that's if you don't know if I'm trying to write something here, if 21 trillion is hard to explain, and I think it is to students, I just show them this map. This shows you how huge the U.S. economy is, right? Because it's, our states tend to have the same size economies as many of the well-known countries. I mean, this one also is pretty remarkable. Venezuela has all that oil down there in South America, Central America. Mexico is among our poorest states, and they produce more GDP generally than does the country of Venezuela with all that oil. So, just a good image maybe for you to use in class if you'd like to. And then it's important to differentiate between real and nominal GDP. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but the important thing is that real GDP, which in my graph is the blue line, this one here, it adjusts for inflation because it uses a base year, 2012, in this example. So whether it be 1950 or 1980 or 2000, that blue line always uses prices from 2012. So therefore, prices have been held constant, and the only way it can go up or down is just for actually producing more or less GDP. So that's why that's the one we look at carefully, is because it tells us we're in a recession. Whenever it goes down, shaded parts of my graph are recession. So that's the one you want to be thinking about, is real GDP adjusted for inflation. You'll notice the two cross in 2012 because they must have the same prices that year, but the other years it's different because the red line is using the prices in that year. So in 1955, the red line uses 1955 prices, but it's a little hard to interpret what that even means for us. So we usually use real GDP. Speaking of prices, let's think about that next. So this shows you areas where we've had a lot of price increases over time. Now, we don't have inflation just because, you know, lettuce or toys cost more. We have inflation when the general level of prices goes up, and this shows you between 98, 2018, where do we have lot in. We've driven a lot of price increases, both in tuition and in textbooks, right? That's where we've seen some of the biggest increases in prices have come really in the higher ed sector. The only thing higher has been in hospitals. But the other things that you and I buy, prices have come down. Like I remember buying the first flat screen TV. I play a lot of golf. I like the PGA Tour. It's really fun to watch in high definition. So I really wanted to get a high definition TV when they first came out, and it was really expensive. But today, you can get one at Best Buy for $100. So they've really come down in price over time. So how do you measure inflation? And that's a big topic right now. Why I wanted to make sure we talked about it, because if you teach financial literacy, of course it matters, because inflation deteriorates the value of an investment or the value of your savings over time. But it's also in the news right now because we've had very high inflation recently. So there's two ways to measure it, at least two ways to measure it, that are well known. One is this thing called the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. That's done by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and they really look at what do households buy. That one's important because that's how we adjust lots of contracts, including Social Security benefits at the end of the year. We move them up by what the CPI went up by, or other union contracts, for example. And then core CPI just means that you remove food and energy from the CPI. You do that because they often have kind of volatile prices. I didn't just talk about this much, but because this is in the news so much, the other kind of inflation is called personal consumption expenditures. Different government agency does this one, but it's not based on what we buy, but it's based on what's actually sold by businesses. An example of that might be that they would not only consider what you and I spend on healthcare, but what our employer spends on the part they pay, for example. So it also accounts for the fact that we often make substitution when we buy stuff. So the CPI is a fixed basket that assumes we do the same thing every month. We don't actually behave that way. So the PCE one is based on what's actually been sold. So it's not indexed based on a weighted index. It's based on what actually happened. Let me try to show you what I mean by that. The CPI is this fictional thing, this fictional market basket of what Americans buy every month, and that they sort of assume that the average family spends 41% on housing, and that's probably for most of us our biggest expenses, our mortgage payment or our rent payment. Then it assumes the next biggest thing would be getting around, transportation, so gas, car payment, insurance, and the third would be eating. So then they use these weights. They assume, then they fictionally go and say how much of these things cost each month. They write it down, and then they do this in different locations, and then they're able to say, hey, the cost of living is higher, in Milwaukee than it is in Minocqua. So that's the way that one works. But the other one, the PCE one, there's no weights. It's actually what was sold. So it's data on what was actually sold, not weighted. So because of that, this graph's hard to interpret. I'll move to a new one in a second, but this shows, I'm graphing here both the PCE thing here is blue, without food and energy. The PCE is red. The CPI is green, and the CPI without food and energy is purple. This graph is a little hard to deal with, but it shows a few things that are important. One, we had very high inflation, no matter how you measure it, in the 1970s and early 80s. I think most of us know that. So we had very high inflation then, maybe 12 to 15%. We had some deflation coming out of recessions, so that's firms had to cut prices to be able to sell stuff. But we clearly have an increase in inflation right now. And my next graph is easier to look at because it's less time. So here we go. So what this one shows is that whether you want to measure it by the PCE, which is red, or you want to measure it by the CPI, which is green, either way, we've had a big increase in prices. In fact, we don't have the PCE yet for last month because, again, it takes time. That one you have to actually get data on. The CPI is easy to do because it's not based on what actually happened, but it's based on a fictional market basket writing stuff down. So the big news this week or last week was that the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, increased by like 5.5% in June, and that was the biggest increase in many, many years. So we have a fair amount of inflation going on right now in the U.S. economy, and these bars show you, no matter how you want to measure it, if you remove food and energy, it's a little bit less, but nonetheless, it still is relatively high compared to historical standards. And just as a point of reference, our Federal Reserve system, our Federal Reserve says we want to try to average about 2% inflation. So that would be 2% right there. We're obviously well above that right now. We were below it during the pandemic. So that's where we're at right now. Now, as I said before, one problem with the CPI is that it doesn't account for substitution. It can't. It's a fixed basket. But you and I behave differently than that. We don't just buy the same thing every month. Like if you and I go to Pick and Save or wherever and you're planning to buy raspberries, but they're $15 per pint, you'll probably buy a substitute, like maybe strawberries, right? That can't be accommodated by the CPI because it has to be a fixed basket. The other one I showed you, the PC, that's why it's been in the news so much and why I wanted to show it to you. That's the one they're tracking right now because it actually says what's being sold. Do we have inflation in that stuff? Okay. And this is the CPI again. Now you'll see where we have, this is from June, where we have a lot of inflation. Well, one, airlines. You guys surprised me, want to fly again. Used cars and trucks. Look at that. They're up 45%. My son was really excited about that when he needed to buy a car. And some energy related things here, a bit expensive. And then some of the services like food away from home and things have increased a fair amount. So that's what's driving in transportation. That's what's driving inflation right now. A lot of it is service stuff as things open up. I want to go fly again, so there's a lot of competition for airlines. So I think it probably makes some sense. So it's not only the U.S. and other countries have also, not so much Japan, but other countries have seen some inflation again because they've been opening up. And this shows on the right-hand side, the Economist magazine chart shows a lot of the inflation has been in things that are service-related as the economy opens. Housing, used cars, medical services. We want to get things done now that they delayed, that kind of thing. And this is just a chart of three things I want to look at inflation. So we have inflation in the blue line, which is steak. It really spiked. Beef really spiked last spring, but it's still high. The red line is home prices. So they've gone way up. And then the green line is used cars and trucks. And they've gone way up in the last few months, the last couple of quarters really of the year. Because I think we can explain that. You know, it's one, we've had a demand side increase, which is people opening up and wanting to go out and spend money. So that's led to a lot of the services. Two, we saved a lot of money during the pandemic, so we have money to spend. And three, we've had some supply problems like chips that go into cars. So if you can't build new cars, then there's lots of competition for used cars. And I just read this morning in the Wall Street Journal about people who didn't intend to trade in their car, but they're finding they can get more for it than they paid themselves for a used car. That's rare, right? Where dealers are paying you more than you paid for it, usually depreciate, and they're finding they can actually get more for them than put to buy something else. But it's a weird time where we can sell used cars in some cases for more than what you originally paid a couple of years ago for them. So if you want to think about inflation, I think this is a useful activity for students. So Babe Ruth made 80 grand back in 1931. And that was controversial because that was a higher salary than President Hoover. That time, athletes wouldn't make more than the president. But the joke was that Ruth had a better year. Hoover was in the Great Depression, and things weren't going so great for him. And Ruth had an amazing year. In fact, this 46 home runs was more than all the teams in baseball except for the Phillies. So Ruth had an amazing, amazing year. And when he played, you could go to a movie for a quarter. You could buy an ice cream cone for a nickel. Today, the average player makes $4.2 million. Highest paid player makes $37 million. So the question I would do if we were together is, you know, we know that 80 grand in 31 is worth more than 80 grand today, because look at how low prices were. Right? Doesn't make a lot of sense to say Ruth made 80,000 because we can't even compare that to today. You have to adjust it for inflation. And there's a way to do that, which I'm not going to do because it's too risky to leave my PowerPoint and go to a website. But this website here does it for you. It just says, hey, how much money in what year is equivalent to what today? And you can easily do this calculator yourself. You do it on your own. But what it's really doing is taking the salary in 31, which is 80 grand, and multiplying it by the ratio of the CPIs. And because I'm not going to do it in front of you, I'll just tell you, it would come out to 1.3 million. So Ruth made the equivalent in 31 of making 1.3 million today. So Ruth was very wealthy, right? A wealthy man, but nothing like today's players. But of course, there was no TV when Ruth played, which led to a lot more money for the players. But the point is, you have to adjust for inflation, or it's really hard to compare dollar figures over time. Right now, we have 5% inflation in a month this year. That's going to make an impact on our salaries. It makes an impact on our investments and things like that. So students should understand how to adjust for inflation. Another example is this. So here are the highest grossing movies if you don't adjust for inflation. And you'll notice that many of them are pretty recent. If you do adjust for inflation, the list changes a lot. In fact, you get a different Star Wars. Only Titanic hangs in there. And you get some movies from the past, like when Gone with the Wind came out in 39, I think it cost like 3 cents to see it. So if you adjust for inflation, the ones on the right, the real terms ones, are the most popular movies of all time. The list on the left is really kind of meaningless. It just says that, hey, we've had inflation, so our currency devalued, so it costs more to see it. Doesn't tell us anything about what was the most popular, really. All right, and this is what I was saying. I think we have inflation right now because, one, we have very low interest rates. That's spurred a lot of spending on houses and new cars and things. People have money to spend because we couldn't spend it during the pandemic. People want to spend it on things like services and traveling and going out and going on vacation, so that's driving a lot of demand. And there's a shortage of people to work at these places. When we were in Green Bay last week for our workshops, every restaurant, they tried so hard, but it was so obvious that they just didn't have enough employees. It would be, they tell us it was a half an hour, but there were tons of tables open. Or once we sat down, you got no silverware and nobody came to see it for 15 minutes. It was just clear they were really struggling to make it work. And even at Lodge Kohler, a high-end place, the teenage girls that were working in the bar upstairs clearly didn't know what they were doing and needed some practice. They didn't have time they were obviously new. Everywhere I go, it seems like that's the case. So that's leading to a misspelled stimulus, but the government spending obviously impacts inflation too. They, in many cases, gave us money directly or spending money themselves, which is leading to more spending. And the supply side, We've had issues with transportation of goods and services, but also we've had things like a shutdown of being able to produce semiconductors, being able to produce chips for cars or other products. That's led to shortages of things. So you get a lot of demand and less supply, and you get higher prices, and that's what we really have right now. And this just shows you that there's been a lot of saving going on, especially in the U.S. and Canada. We've really ratcheted up our savings above normal savings. All right, so the last thing we'll do today is talk about unemployment. So Harry Truman famously said that it's a recession when your neighbor loses his job, but a depression when you lose your own, which is probably true for all of us. And there's all kinds of costs of unemployment beyond just not getting paid. It tends to affect our self-esteem. It affects crime and mental illness, all kinds of problems. So we try to avoid unemployment when possible. Again, this works better if we're in person, but so I'll just do it. So I would have asked you, employed people are people with jobs. That answer is true, yeah. So if you have a job, the government counts you as employed. That's true. So the BLS stands for Bureau of Labor Statistics. They do a monthly household survey of 60,000 residences, and if you're working part or full time, you are considered employed. So that's for sure true. Having a job means you're employed. That seems obvious. This also seems obvious, but it's false. And most of you probably know this, but just not having a job does not make you unemployed. As you probably know, you have to be looking for work. So my grandparents are not unemployed. All three of my kids are working right now. Patrick has an internship in Cincinnati, we go to college. Matthew was at a golf course. Elizabeth, Ellie works at Panera. So they are all employed. But when I told Ellie back like in May, you need to find a job, young lady, she's 16. She all of a sudden went from being a full-time student who's not unemployed. The minute she started looking and went over to the mall and made some applications, she became unemployed. Right? She quickly went from being not in the labor force to being unemployed. So full-time students are not unemployed, but once they look for work, they become unemployed. Retired people are not unemployed. Stay-at-home parents are not unemployed. You have to be looking for work. So that one was not true because you have to not have a job, and you have to look for work in the last 4 weeks. So to be in the labor force, you have to be either working or looking for work. And that's what my third question gets at. Who's in the labor force? It's these people. You have to be a civilian. We don't count the military. You can't be in prison. We don't count the prison population. 16 or older, so my daughter Ellie counts. You have to either have a job or be looking for a job. That is the American labor force. 16, civilian, not in prison, working, looking for work. And what's it look like today? Well, the labor force has about 160 million people in it. Of that 160 million, 9.4 million are unemployed, and that's why the rate today is 5.9%. Another important statistic is there are 260 million Americans in the United States. As you already saw from above there, the top bullet, 160 million are in the labor force, so the rest are not in the labor force. So they must be retired or full-time students or caring for people or stay-at-home parents, whatever. So about 61.6% of our adults are in the labor force, which we call that the labor force participation rate. The highest unemployment rate currently is in Hawaii. Maybe not surprising given dependent upon tourism and some issues with people being able to get there. And then New Hampshire has the lowest right now, which is rare. We normally have not. New Hampshire is not a number one you usually see on here, but I think they've had a very good vaccination record. They've been able to open up quickly. So Victor, you asked me how to keep with the gig economy. That really shouldn't matter here because this is a household survey. So if you say you're working, that's going to be enough no matter what you're doing. Even if it's part-time, that counts in this survey as being employed. There are other issues with the gig economy like collecting unemployment. That's a different thing. But these numbers, the well-known unemployment rate you see every month released, comes from a household survey, and really it's a survey of what you say. So if you're working, even if you're an Uber driver, that's what you do full-time or whatever, that is your job. You are working. You are employed. So that's what the rate has looked like over time. So you can see that it kind of peaked at 10% back in 2010. That was right after the financial crisis. And it came down really substantially. This was one of the lowest in U.S. history here. I think it hit 3.9 or something like that percent. But then this, again, this is the same kind of graph. Like I said at the beginning, I would have said, no, that's not possible. How could in a month it fly way up to almost 15% and then come all the way back down to where we are today? Well, that would be a pandemic, right? That's the only thing that could cause it. We've never had anything like this before. It had to have been a shutdown kind of thing, not a normal economic activity. So again, the pandemic is shown in the unemployment data. It's also interesting to look at who was unemployed. This is actually employment, employed. But during the pandemic, let's look back here. Who was really hurt? Well, those with the least education. So the purple bars are less than high school. The green is high school grads, and then red's some college, and blue is bachelor's degree. Folks like probably you and I that have bachelor's degrees really saw very little impact on our employment. I just switched to doing what I'm doing right now, right? I moved home and did my job from this office, and everybody I work with knows the books on my shelf behind me because they've seen me on this thing 3 times a day for the last year. In fact, I read about, these are real books, I could prove it to you, but I read a story in the journal that some people were buying facades of books because they're going to be home so much. They wanted to look smart, so they bought like the classics. It wasn't actually the books, it was a thing you slid in there in cardboard. It looked like the books because they wanted a good backdrop of looking smart. Those are real books back there. But then when we snap back, who really has gained? Well, it's been those who, again, who lost their jobs at least education. Now we really need them because we have all these service job openings. So who was hurt? Well, if you have a high school diploma, you probably work in some kind of a customer-facing service job, and that was very hard to do last spring and early last summer. Today, though, they're very much in demand, as you know. So the chart, once again, shows that. It shows what's happened over time. And this is interesting. What I did here was I divided the unemployment, number unemployed by the job openings. And you'll see here, so for example, right here, this says there were about 6.5 job openings for every, no, there were about 6.5 unemployed people for every job opening. This actually, so this is one. This actually shows that right before the pandemic recession, there were more job openings. This is less than one. There were more job openings than unemployed people. That's how strong the economy was. And we're almost back to that again now, where it's about 1 to 1. So there's about as many unemployed as there are job openings. Of course, the problem is the job openings don't necessarily fit the people who want them that are unemployed. Like, if you've lost your job and you're in sales, you're probably not going to get a job at the open bar restaurant that has a job. Or vice versa, if you lost your job in a service area, but we need computer scientists, you're unlikely to be a good candidate for those kind of jobs. So it's a mismatch, but it's about 1 to 1 right now. Last spring, it had gone up to 5 to 1. That is 5 unemployed for every 1 opening, but it's come back now to almost 1 to 1, which is sort of an interesting place we're in. And this is, I think, all the participation rates, so the share of adults in the labor force. It went way up between 50s because that was females, women who worked a lot less before 1950. As women started to work more full-time, more, that drove up the share of adults in the labor force. This part here is the old baby boomers. So they retired faster than young people have come into the labor force. So now we see a declining share of adults in the labor force because baby boomers retired quickly, many of them, and they aren't replaced by young people. And this just shows the pandemic. So, we shot way down in terms of the adult labor force. People, didn't want to work because it was maybe unsafe or they didn't want to be around people. And that's come back some, but not fully yet. So we're not fully back where we were before the pandemic. But there probably are still people that carry for kids at home maybe, or just aren't willing to work right now. And the last thing I'm going to show you is the unemployment rate. Many say it underestimates it because one, there are these folks who aren't looking, but they want to work. Like if I have a neighbor who's out of work, and he might tell me in my yard, he really wants a job, but he stopped trying to find one because he can't find anything. Maybe he didn't look in the last 4 weeks. I would describe him as unemployed to you and I, but the government doesn't put him in that category because you can look in the last 4 weeks. We call those people discouraged workers. They stop trying for whatever reason. And then part-time, my wife works part-time, and in most of my life, the folks I know who work part-time wanted part-time because they want flexibility, perhaps. It turns out, though, that the majority of part-time work in the U.S., they don't want any part-time. They just can't find a full-time job. So they're kind of like half unemployed, right? That's what you might say about them. So the government does, people say that is the government lying. No, they track this. You just have to look more carefully. So the normal unemployment rate is called U3. That's 5.9% right now. But if you count everybody, if you count the what are called marginally attached, that's basically discouraged workers. You count those who are part-time for economic reasons, that is, can't find a full-time job, then you really find yourself at more like 9.8%. So this is a number that policymakers watch. So even if this one goes low, 5.9, this one needs to come down too, where people aren't, there are many people who are being left behind is the idea, right? Even though they may not be in this statistic, we need to watch it because maybe a lot of folks who are part-time but can't find a full-time job, well, then the economy isn't strong enough for them, and we probably should continue to try to find ways to improve things for their situation. Yeah, you did it. So that's a lot of economics, but hopefully it's somewhat useful, and I can certainly take questions now on either presentation, but most importantly on what we just did. If something you didn't understand or something you want to ask me about, I'd be happy to answer it. I answered a couple in the chat. I see we asked about the gig economy. We talked about that already. But if there's anything else that that concerns you or you have a question about, I'd love to respond to that. You can always, and of course, you can always email me afterwards. And if there's something you specifically are interested in, I might have something I can send you that might be helpful. But since we have a minute, though, I should show you all these graphs I made. I always use this thing called FRED. That stands for Federal Reserve Economic Data. So if you just Google FRED St. Louis, this is the St. Louis Fed, you'll find it. These graphs look very sophisticated, but they're extremely easy to make. I mean, even if you're not really into data, you or your students could easily do this. And it automatically puts the recession bars on here for me. It asks you what time period you want. So like the one where I shortened it, that took me one click, and shortened it. When I put two or three things on there, it just says, hey, do you want to add a line? Like when I showed the three kinds of transportation, right? Air, whatever, that was no big deal. And if you're a little bit adept at doing this, you can actually create an account at this website, Fred, and then every time I log in, it updates my chart. It knows what I want. I always want this thing. I always want unemployment. I always want GDP. Well, when I return, if there's new data, it will automatically update it for me in my account. And then you can, and literally the choice, hey, put it to PowerPoint, and that's what it does for you. So that's very easy to do. And it's also very easy to assign students to do if you want to ask them to go, create graphs of certain economic data and talk about them. I think a lot of the ones I showed you, I think they're interesting because they kind of show the effect of a pandemic on the economy. And obviously, you and I have lived all that stuff, and you would have predicted it all happening. But it's sort of interesting to see that the data actually shows our lived experience. That's what it should be doing, right? That's the whole point of collecting data. So anything else I can answer before we go to our big prizes? Okay, I think looks like we're, unless you're seeing something in Aaron, I'm not. I think we're good.
I'm not seeing any other questions, but that was great, Scott. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today and to volunteer to share your knowledge with teachers. We really appreciate it. Also want to say thanks to our sponsors, the CVM Foundation, Next Gen Personal Finance, and UW Credit Union. So they help to make sure that we're able to provide these sessions for free and have them available to you. So thank you to them. And we'll get into our fabulous prizes here. So we are going to be giving away, as I mentioned earlier, Scott's book that he has out, Teachers Can Be Financially Fit. So this is your opportunity to learn through his work that he's done with, you may remember Mark Shug. Yes, there it is. Thank you, Scott. You may remember Mark Shug. He's been a longtime partner to FLIFEL, and he presented earlier this year on the book itself, and we gave away a few books that day. And we're looking forward to giving away a few more here. I'm trying to share my screen so that I can share my little
I'll stop sharing.
fun wheel of names here.
You should be good now. Yeah, I had to stop sharing.
Thank you. So only letting me share the file. So I will just make this really dramatic and read out the names so that it's still exciting. So I'm going to give the wheel a big spin for the first book. And if you're on, could you just drop into the chat right away that you're on and that you would like the book? We'll give away 2 books. And I'll just need those of you who win to get me your address so that I can send the book to you. So the wheel is spinning and it's slowing down, and the wheel has landed on the person with the initials TD. I'm not sure who that is, but if you're still on, could you drop your name into the chat, please, or let us know over chat, please? Is TD still on? All right, awesome. So TD, I'll be dropping my email address here in the chat. And if you can send me your address where you'd like the book to be sent, I'll get that off to you. All right, so we've got one more book to give away here. We'll give the big wheel a spin. The wheel is spinning. And it looks like Donna is our winner. Donna, if you're still on and would like the book, please let us know over chat and make sure that, hi Donna, thank you. So TD and Donna, thanks for being here today, and we'll get that book sent off to you if you send me your address at ebykowski@uwcu. Oh, I put my email address in wrong. It's ebykowski@uwcu.org. Too many email addresses. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming today, for taking time out of your summer to learn with us. We hope that you'll attend FLIFEL sessions coming up this fall. We'll be doing another series. For now, we're sticking with the webinar format. We're hoping at some point to be able to do a combination of in-person and webinars. So stay tuned. Keep an eye out for those emails from Dave Mansell from the Department of Financial Institutions to be updated on what we're planning for the fall. So we hope everybody has a great rest of your summer. Thank you for all you do. And a big thank you to Scott again for being with us today.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Erin, can you share your email in the chat, please?
Yep, I can put it in there again. It's
Or I can
ebykowski
can I just
wcu.org.
put my address in the chat? Okay.
Yeah, if you're comfortable with that, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't care.
Okay.
Erin, you're going to want to stop recording, just so you know.
Oh, thank you.